We have with us this evening a very interesting and important panel. They include, beginning on my immediate left, Dr. Leonardo Trasande, who is the Policy Director of the Center for Children's Health and the Environment at the Mount Sinai School of Medicine. Next to Dr. Trasande is Lee Conrad, the National Coordinator, Alliance IBM Communication Workers of America, Local 1701, here on behalf of the workers at IBM. And finally, William Deprospo, who is a very prominent lawyer with the Deprospo, Patrizio, Longo, and Bartlett law firm, which is located in Goshen, New York, and who has contacts on issues such as the one that we're dealing with this evening in many places across the country. Before we begin, I'd like to just establish a little background. This event tonight was prompted in part by some national news items. Actually, they were op-ed pieces in the New York Times by Bob Herbert, in which he described problems occurring in New York, California, and in places in the Midwest of our country. Patterns of illnesses experienced by workers involved in the production of semiconductors, disk drive manufacturing, laboratory work, and related electronics. Cases of cancer and other illnesses found at IBM and other locations in other parts of the country. For example, San Jose in California and East Fishkill in New York appear very consistent with initial findings here in Endicott. A survey that my office conducted last spring showed a surprising number of illnesses, particularly cancer, experienced by local residents. A third of the people who responded to that survey experienced cancer. Many have multiple health disorders. Additionally, most respondents have an immediate family member who developed cancer while living in the Endicott area. This information made it clear that what we are going through here in Endicott is not unlike what communities and former workers have experienced elsewhere in the country. It was clear that the situation here deserved the same level of attention, and that is our purpose here this evening. Last fall, we initiated contact with some key players involved in class action suits representing families of deceased IBM workers. These include Dr. Richard Clapp of Boston University, who is an associate of Dr. Trasande, and Richard Alexander of the San Jose-based law firm of Alexander, Hawkins, and Audette, who are colleagues of Bill Deprospo, who is with us this evening. The information gained from these gentlemen was compelling, particularly existence of data held by IBM on employee mortality and IBM's environmental, chemical, and occupational evaluation system known as ECHOS. These files could offer tremendous insight into the types of illnesses common to IBM workers, as well as the quantities and kinds of chemicals used at IBM's facility here in Endicott. Dr. Clapp's research, for example, based on this information, found that IBM workers died of certain cancers at younger ages and higher rates than the general population. His research also found that the company knew about the higher rates and that this knowledge was held by the company for many, many years. Mention of this sort of information had been absent from discussions that we have had to date with federal, state, and local officials, as well as with IBM itself. After reviewing documentation of this ECHOS file, the Environmental, Chemical, and Occupational Evaluation System, that file, and IBM personnel data systems, I wrote to IBM, who's the vice president of IBM in charge of environmental affairs, Wayne Balta, back in September of last year, in an attempt to engage the company to be forthcoming with any and all information that may assist the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, a federal agency, which we have involved in this issue, and other investigating agencies with the health study which has now commenced. We have not yet received a reply from the letter sent to Vice President Wayne Balta of IBM back in September. Our prior interaction with the Agency for Toxic Substance and Disease Registry at the federal level included a July meeting with the Assistant Administrator, Henry Falk, and also with the fact that I inserted some language in an appropriations bill which directed the ATSDR to become involved with this situation here in Endicott. As a result of those conversations and the language in that appropriation bill, ATSDR has now been out here conducting the initial phases of their investigation. Since June, we have been calling for a comprehensive health study to establish a full understanding of the health risks confronting Endicott residents. That, of course, is critically important. The work that ATSDR and the New York State Department of Health are engaged in now must go further than previous health studies in this area and determine whether environmental exposure is linked to elevated health problems for residents and former IBM workers alike. The draft Public Health Response Plan is a very positive development, but it does not appear to be balanced in its content. The document includes the call for a study on illnesses common to workers in Endicott's former boot and shoe industry, which is not inappropriate at all. But it gives little attention to the tens of thousands of former IBM workers, many of whom suffered work-related illnesses. Obviously, this needs to be corrected, and we have begun the process by which we hope that those corrections will come about. We also made opinions clear on this disparity in a letter that I sent to the administrator of ATSDR just last week. Now, ATSDR and the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health are sensitive to this criticism and have been in contact with my office already to discuss the status of the research, the kind of research which we have advocated for, research into illnesses common to IBM workers. This research is at its earliest stages. In their words, the words of people that we've spoken to at ATSDR and NIOSH, a feasibility study is underway to evaluate whether further study into the mortality rates of former IBM workers is warranted. Within 6 months to 1 year, this feasibility study should be completed, and then a more comprehensive, detailed study would commence. These are not necessarily the bold strokes that we might hope for, but we are dealing with a situation in which it is essential that we have a very scientific, careful, detailed approach. This is something that can't be done on a fly-by-night basis. It's got to be done very, very carefully, and it has to have full and complete scientific bases for it and for its conclusions. NIOSH staff met this week with IBM officials in Cincinnati. The National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health met with the IBM officials in Cincinnati to discuss the type of data that IBM maintains on employees and how such data may be delivered to NIOSH for examination. And that, of course, is the most recent and positive and I think a very effective development. So I must say that I'm happy in some ways with the progress that we're making with the federal agencies and the cooperation that we've had from people outside. We have yet to have the kind of cooperation that I would like to see from the state agencies, and they are the ones who are on the line here. They're the ones who are principally involved in this in the first analysis. And those are, of course, the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation and the State Department of Health, and we will continue to work with them to try to persuade them that they must take a different approach here, which is more detailed, more comprehensive, and they need to be more fully involved. With that introduction now, it is with great pleasure that I will introduce to you Dr. Leo Trasande. As I said, Dr. Trasande is the Policy Director of the Center for Children's Health and the Environment at the Mount Sinai School of Medicine, and I am very deeply grateful to him for coming up here this evening. Doctor, welcome, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Congressman Hinchey, for the opportunity to speak at this important forum. My name is Dr. Leo Trasande. I'm a pediatrician and environmental health specialist in the Pediatric Environmental Health Specialty Unit at the Mount Sinai School of Medicine. one of 10 centers nationwide supported by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention to provide consultations for children with toxic environmental exposures and diseases of suspected environmental origin. I'm also the Assistant Director for the Center for Children's Health and the Environment at Mount Sinai, a policy research center that works to protect children from environmental threats to health. In speaking here today, I hope to provide information about the health effects of trichloroethylene in humans and the need to study and prevent the health effects that can result from the chemical exposures that have occurred in Endicott. Trichloroethylene, or TCE, is an organic chemical that has been used for dry cleaning, metal degreasing, and as a solvent for oils and resins. It evaporates easily in the open air, but can stay in the soil and in the groundwater for years afterwards. It is one of the most commonly found chemicals at Superfund sites. In the body, trichloroethylene may break down into multiple other chemicals, such as dichloroacetic acid, trichloroacetic acid, and some other chemicals that I could name, but are probably not as relevant. What is relevant is that these products have been shown to be toxic to animals and are probably toxic to humans, especially young children with developing bodies. The most well-studied and significant health effect of TCE is its link to cancer. While studies of workers exposed to TCE are sometimes complicated to interpret because many of these workers have been exposed to other solvents that can also cause health effects, TCE has been found to cause cancer in both mice and rats, which suggests that it also causes cancer in humans. In 2000, researchers at the Robert Wood Johnson Medical School reviewed 80 studies that looked for a link between workplace exposure to TCE and cancer. They found evidence for an increased risk of kidney cancer, liver cancer, and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. They also found possible associations between TCE exposure and multiple myeloma and prostate, laryngeal, and colon cancers. Based on this data, the World Health Organization has classified TCE as a Class 2A carcinogen, meaning that TCE probably causes cancer in humans. The Environmental Protection Agency has also stated that TCE may have the potential to cause cancer in humans and has set a maximum contaminant level for TCE of 5 parts per million in drinking water. Other effects that can result from heavy TCE exposure include damage to the liver, kidneys, the gastrointestinal system, and the skin. TCE has also been linked to birth defects. Chronic exposure to TCE can also affect the central nervous system. Case reports of intermediate and chronic occupational exposures have included effects such as dizziness, headache, sleepiness, nausea, confusion, blurred vision, and weakness. For all of these reasons, all occupational exposures to TCE should be thoroughly investigated. Not only do the workers who've been exposed to TCE deserve to know the potential health effects that they have suffered, but further research into the health effects of TCE will help clarify important questions that remain about its health effects, as Congressman Hinchey has so aptly noted. Dr. Richard Clapp, a researcher at Boston University's School of Medicine, has studied the health effects of TCE using IBM's corporate mortality files from workers in other areas of the United States, such as San Jose, California. In addition, we also need to consider the effects of TCE contamination on people in the broader community. For example, children are especially vulnerable to the health effects of TCE, just as they are to many other chemicals. Children are more susceptible because pound for pound they ingest more chemicals in the food they eat, the water they drink, and the air they breathe. Their organ systems are just developing, and injury to these developing organs can cause lifelong disability. The health and economic consequences of children's present-day exposures to environmental toxins will be experienced by our society throughout much of the length of the 21st century. Unfortunately, we've already learned this lesson the hard way, in part because of exposures to chemicals such as TCE. A very high rate of childhood cancers in Toms River, New Jersey, was found to be linked to the amount of drinking water that women ingested during their pregnancies. Even though the water was never found to have levels higher than EPA's contamination standard for TCE, the researchers' analysis demonstrated that exposure to TCE in the fetus was associated with cancer, especially leukemia in these children. The epidemiologists who studied this cluster of cancer suggested that the developing fetus might be especially vulnerable to TCE and other chemicals that were found in the drinking water in Toms River. As the exposure to TCE was removed, researchers found that the cancer rates in Toms River decreased significantly. I tell you this story not to scare you or to distract the needed attention to your concerns about TCE here in Endicott, but I do mean to focus your attention on the fact that there are other environmental health concerns here in Endicott, in Binghamton, and throughout New York State. Children today face environmental hazards that were neither known nor imagined a few decades ago. Children are especially at risk of exposure to the nearly 15,000 synthetic chemicals that are produced in quantities greater than 10,000 pounds per year, and to the 2,800 produced in quantities greater than 1 million pounds per year, which are so-called high production volume or HPV chemicals. Many of these materials are contained in household products and are dispersed widely in the environment. Many hundreds of these HPV chemicals have not even been tested for their potential human toxicity, and only 7% have been studied for their possible effects on human development or on the health of children. Today, the prominent diseases confronting children in New York and across the United States are a series of chronic illnesses that have been termed the new pediatric morbidity. Many are increasing in frequency. Evidence is growing that environmental factors contribute to the etiology of these conditions. Examples include ADHD, autism, and childhood cancer. Healthcare providers like pediatricians can help limit children's exposures to environmental hazards by educating parents like you who are in the audience, identifying hazardous exposures, diagnosing and treating children, and advocating for prevention. However, doctors have little training, generally speaking, in environmental health. A study of Georgia pediatricians found that 54% of pediatricians reported seeing patients seriously affected by environmental exposures, but found that only 1 in 5 had received specific training in environmental pediatrics. Pediatricians who ask about environmental exposures usually limit what they ask for to lead and environmental tobacco smoke. We at Mount Sinai have a pediatric environmental health specialty unit that provides consultation and medical care for children with environmental exposures and with diseases of suspected environmental origin in New York, New Jersey, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands. However, we serve mostly as a telephone consultation resource, and many families find it difficult to come to New York City for a complete evaluation. That is why we're interested in developing a statewide network of children's environmental health centers in New York State. This network would provide New York pediatricians with the training they need to prevent and treat environmental exposures in children and serve as a referral network for children with more serious or complex environmental exposures. These 6 children's environmental health clinical centers, one of which would be in Binghamton at SUNY Binghamton, would increase the accuracy of diagnosis of children's diseases caused by environmental toxins, improve the prevention and treatment of children's diseases caused by environmental toxins, and serve as regional resources for the surrounding areas in New York State. This network can also track the environmental exposures in children so that we really can determine the number of children's diseases that are caused by environmental toxins, and help public health officials like ATSDR, who's involved in the Endicott situation, prevent children from being harmed by toxic environmental exposures. We're in the process of developing this proposal for the New York State Assembly, and would really appreciate your help and feedback, potentially as part of even this forum. We would really appreciate your advice about resources that would be helpful to the community here in Endicott and in other places in New York State. We'd like to know whether you would like to have your child seen and evaluated and treated in this sort of clinic for environmental health concerns. Thank you for taking the time to listen to me this evening, and thank you especially to Congressman Hinchey for organizing this important forum. I would be more than happy to answer your questions about TCE and would especially appreciate any feedback you might have about this statewide network of children's environmental health clinics. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you very much. And I think we'll have some time for questions in just a few moments. I'd like now to introduce Lee Conrad, who is here as the organizer, I believe, of the Alliance at IBM, and who is very interested in this issue generally, but particularly as it affects the IBM workers.
Thank you, Congressman Hinchey. Thanks for bringing this panel together. Thank you for inviting me. And thank you all for coming. It's good to see some co-workers from IBM out there in this audience. I think the meeting tonight is very important. It kind of broadens the focus The focus over the last couple of months has been on the residents in Endicott, the vapors coming up through the buildings. The IBM workers, the EIT workers have been exposed to the fumes and the liquids and the chemicals for many, many years. And those that lived in Endicott were faced with double jeopardy. They went from the plant to their home and were exposed twice, same with their children. We also need to keep in mind the Owego facility, who has the same kind of groundwater pollution, whose workers also work with some of the same chemicals we did, perchloroethylene, trichlor, methylchloroform, and the Glendale lab right down the street. So at one time we had 11,000 IBM workers in this valley, and I think we're starting to see the ramifications of working with chemicals at that plant. Throughout our careers at work at IBM, we made many assumptions based on what we were told by IBM management. We assumed we would have a good pension. We assumed we would have medical benefits and that they would be free. We also assumed that IBM was a safe place to work and employees in their communities would be safe from the toxic bombardments we saw with other companies. That assumption, like others, has been misleading. Employees and their families have been faced with the ultimate takeaway, their health and their lives. For those of us that worked in IBM's manufacturing plants in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, we know full well that something was just not right. Many now are seeing not only their own health affected, but their co-workers' health affected as well. In Endicott, workers for many years suspected that the chemicals they worked with in buildings 47 and 18 caused health problems. Women employees felt there was a higher than normal rate of miscarriages and birth defects. Many employees complained of lung ailments and skin rashes. Still others suffered with cancers and tumors, and all the while management and company doctors tried to convince us that it was our own individual problem or allergy. Workers were also told, if you don't like working here, then quit. It was clear to employees that regardless of complaints, production would not be disrupted. In a New York Times article about a lawsuit by former Fishkill IBM employees, the mother of a daughter who died from cancer said, "I think our daughter and others have been the byproduct of greed over safety. The company was more concerned with making the dollar than with the safety of their employees. They knew there were hazards, but they closed their eyes to them to keep the line moving." Many current and former employees are closely watching the trial in San Jose, California, where former IBM employees are suing the company for what they allege is IBM's neglect in adequately protecting them from the ravages of working with toxic chemicals. It's not the first trial, and it will not be the last. Hopewell Junction and Endicott are in battles with the company over toxic plumes that have polluted their communities, and IBM employees and retirees around the country are keeping a watchful eye on their property value and their health. While the recent focus has been on IBM clean rooms, IBMers know the problem goes way beyond clean rooms. Many IBM employees were exposed to chemicals in many different work areas in many processes. The IBM clean room just happened to be getting the most attention right now. IBM employees, former employees, and concerned community members must band together nationwide to get IBM to do the right thing, to expose what's been happening inside this company, to make them fix the problem they created. The Alliance for Beginners is proposing the following. Release to current and former IBM employees all information related to their working with or around hazardous materials while employed by IBM. Release all documentation on any tracking IBM did on health concerns and deaths of employees who were exposed to toxic chemicals and substances. And if they say tracking wasn't done, we must hold IBM accountable, and they must track the health concerns of current and former employees who are exposed to these hazardous materials, and this information should be released to spouses, children, immediate relatives of the affected workers, as well as physicians and researchers. There needs to be intervention by the federal health agencies to make sure that IBM fixes this problem. And finally, IBM should keep the promise of free lifetime medical benefits. IBM exposed employees to health hazards and should be obligated to cover the expenses of treatment. This should include IBMers also sold off from IBM, like the EIT workers down the street. For IBM, there should be no peace and no rest until there's justice for current and former IBM employees living and dying with toxic time bombs. Thank you.
Thank you, Lee. Third member of our panel this evening is William Deprospo. Bill is a very prominent attorney in Orange County and the head of his own law firm over in Goshen, and he has some very extensive experience in the field that we are turning our attention to this evening. Bill, thank you very much.
Thank you, Congressman Hinchey. First of all, I want to thank the Congressman for putting this forum together tonight. For those of you that don't know it, the Congressman has been on the cutting edge of environmental protection of his constituents and for all those in the United States. I just want to take a moment to commend the Congressman for the work that he's done over his career. When Congressman Hinchey reached out for me several months ago to discuss this very, very important issue, I felt that it was a privilege for me to talk to Congressman Hinchey about this issue and to have the opportunity to work with him. I just want to explain to you how I got involved in this particular issue, and with this litigation. And if you'll just bear with me for a moment, the reason why I want to explain the story to you is because I envision the community here in Endicott at the point where I was with the community down in the East Fishkill area back in May of 1995. I had, my experience is in investigating things. I'm a former homicide prosecutor out of New York City. When I left the district attorney's office in New York City, I went to join a very, very large negligence law firm with about 60 lawyers. I left because I wanted to do something that I thought was important and that I could call my own. At the time, I was doing very, very well with this law firm. My wife and I had 2 small children, and she was pregnant with our third. And believe it or not, there's a reason why I'm telling you this story. On the first floor of the building, where I had one office and one secretary, was the OBGYN group who had delivered my first 2 sons and was following my wife's care while she was pregnant with our soon-to-be daughter. And a gentleman came into me, and we were in the process of actually setting up my law office. My brother and sister-in-law were helping me. They were putting up wallpaper, and we were getting some books and things like that. And a gentleman knocked on the door, a huge short of a man, a Paul Bunyan type figure, about 6'4", about 260 pounds. And he knocked on the door and said, "I'd like to speak to Mr. Deprospo." And I said, "Well," I said, "you found him." I said, "We don't have any furniture yet, but come on in and pull up a box and we'll chat." And this gentleman's name was Keith Barrett. And Keith started to tell me a story about working in the clean rooms at the East Fishkill facility for IBM. He described working in a clean room. He talked to me about wearing a bunny suit, about taking air showers, all of these things that, quite frankly, to me back in May of 1995 sounded very futuristic, sounded like I was on the set of a Star Trek movie, quite frankly. And I literally had no idea what this gentleman was talking about. But you might understand, with 2 small children and a third on the way, just setting up a business, I was kind of looking for a business angle. And after he told me that he worked at IBM, he said he left and he took a job driving a truck for the Pepsi-Cola company in Newburgh. And not to be off color, what happened to him, because he was such a big guy, was he was the ringer on the company basketball team. And it was a timeout during one of the games, and he got a terrible pain in his left testicle, and he thought his jockstrap had gotten wrapped around his left testicle. So he stuck his hand in his shorts. He detected a lump on his left testicle, was in the doctor's office the next day, wherein he was diagnosed with testicular cancer. Now, everything that I just told you, and I'm sure that means a whole bunch of things to Dr. Trasande, because he's been trained to diagnose and he's eminently qualified, meant absolutely nothing to me other than the fact that I knew this gentleman was really big, he was a really nice guy, he was very, very sick, and he worked at IBM. And I said to myself, from a business perspective, I said, okay, well, there's me, 1 secretary, 2 little kids at home, a third one on the way, and if there is anything to this, I'm going to take on the largest corporation on the planet. And I thought about it, and I thought about it, and I said, this doesn't really sound like a good idea to me. And I said to Keith, I said, Keith, I said, I really don't know if there's anything to this. I said, but you know what? Leave some of the paperwork here. Let me take a look at it, and I'll see if there's anything to it. So he left, and I got my office set up and everything. And fortunately, fate being what it is, Keith and I hit it off in a very, very important way, and I'll get into that in a moment. I started doing a little bit of research Quite frankly, it was my first foray into the internet, so I figured I would put some words in to see what I could find out. So, I put cancer in, and, I got 13 million hits, so that didn't really do me much good. I put testicles in, and that got me to some places where you didn't really want to be. And what I did was I kept researching, and I said, you know what? I said, I'm going to go downstairs, I'm going to talk to these doctors. And a doctor by the name of James Shanahan, who had delivered my first two sons and was soon delivered my little girl, I said to him, listen, doc, I said, I have to ask you a question. I said, this guy came to me, he's working in these clean rooms around these chemicals. I don't even know what these chemicals are. I said, but I want to ask you a very simple question. I said, do you think you can get cancer from working around really bad chemicals? So he said, well, he said to me kind of kiddingly, he said, first of all, he said, I work on the other model. But he said, sure, you sure can. He said, I'd really need to know what the chemicals are before I could give an opinion on it. So I had some of the photo labels, and I started getting some of the MSDS safety sheets from Keith Barrett, and we looked at them, and I wasn't really sure if I had anything. And I called a couple of people. I called a very, very well-known toxicologist out in Denver. I flew out to Denver, and I knew I was in trouble, quite frankly, when I was sitting in his office. I think Dr. Trasande probably knows who he is. It's a gentleman by the name of Danny Teitelbaum, one of the most famous and most qualified toxicologists anywhere in the world. When he opened up a blackboard and he started drawing a picture of an egg and a sperm, and he was like going back to 8th grade biology. And I got this big lecture from him, and I went back to New York, and I thought about it, and I harkened back to my days as a prosecutor in New York City. And the one thing that I learned was to take careful notes and to investigate and to never give up. And I just had a feeling, I thought that I was onto something, and I thought about it for months and months and months. And it dawned on me, I said, you know what, there has to be an easier way to do this. And I woke up in the middle of the night, and it was about 4 o'clock in the morning, and I called up Keith Barrett, and I said, Keith, I said, you have to come into the office, I have this whole thing figured out. So he comes in, he says, listen, he says, it's like the middle of the night, is there a reason why I'm here? So I said, yeah, I said, I got the whole thing figured out. So I said, what's the name of the guy that was working next to me? Oh, Bob Kelleher. I said, well, where does he live? He says, well, he goes, I think he lives over in Wappingers. So I got on the phone 4 o'clock in the morning. I said, listen, I said, I'm really sorry to bother you. My name's Bill Deprospo. I said, I represent a guy by the name of Keith Barrett. He goes, oh, he goes, KB? He said, yeah. I said, KB. He says, what happened? Did he get arrested? Is he in trouble or something? I said, no. I said, he's not in any trouble. I said, but I want to ask you a question. I said, do you have any health problems? Lo and behold, Bob Kelleher was diagnosed with testicular cancer. I thought about it. I said, Bob, I said, let me ask you something. I said, you know anybody else that you work with that's sick? He said, well, he said, I met my wife Evelyn working on the line. That's what they call it, as you all well know. And his wife Evelyn in her 20s had been diagnosed with a malignant brain tumor. So I thought about it, and I said, I have 3 people relatively young, otherwise in good health, doing the same thing at the same time who were very, very sick. So I started to research, and very tragically, the first 11 people that I located all had been diagnosed with cancer. 2 had died of cancer, and nobody made it to the ripe old age of 31. And I know Dr. Trasande will agree with me, when you look at numbers like that, you don't have to be a Mount Sinai or Harvard graduate to figure out that there's something very, very wrong. At that point in time, I knew that there was something very, very wrong going on at the IBM workplace at the East Fishkill facility. And at that point in time, I made it my life's professional mission to find out what they were doing and why the largest corporation on the planet was knowingly killing people and maiming and disfiguring babies. And I worked on it, and I've been working on it to this very, very day, and we continue to work on it. My law firm and 2 other law firms now represent about 300 families of people who have either been diagnosed with some form of cancer in their 20s, 30s, or 40s, have lost somebody at that age, and we represent about 60 families who have given birth to children with severe, crippling, and the most horrific birth defects that I'm sure even Dr. Trasande has seen in his years of practice. After I was retained by those first 11 clients, we were on Dateline with Katie Couric. We got a lot of publicity, as you might imagine. Within 2 weeks of the initial wave of publicity, I went from 11 clients to 23, from 23 to 45, from 45 to 78. And I saw exactly the same thing over and over and over again. I tell you that we represent about 300 families, but that's really only the tip of the iceberg, because unlike what Dr. Trasande and people at Mount Sinai look at, one of the things that kind of prevents us from looking at things in a very, very serious way in the legal profession is something called the statute of limitations. And I can tell you that I've literally received hundreds of phone calls of people who have lost loved ones many, many years ago, that because of the statute of limitations, my law firm and my colleagues are unable to provide any help to them. But I'm sure, as you might imagine, it doesn't make the loss and the tragedy any less for those people and those families who have experienced it. So, if you will, I just want to go over some of the things that have happened. As I said, we presently represent about 300 families of former IBM clean room workers who were employed at the following facilities. At the facility in San Jose, California, the Rochester, Minnesota facility, at the East Fishkill, the Poughkeepsie facility, and at the Essex Junction, Vermont facility. We also now represent 3 families of past or present workers here at the Endicott facility. Our clients, as I said, are IBM employees or former IBM employees who have died of cancer or have cancer or have given birth to children with severe and crippling birth defects. These employees were required by their work to be exposed to toxic solvents every day. IBM promised its employees clean rooms, but IBM's fabrication lines are only clean for the electronic components and the semiconductors. IBM knew that the clean rooms were not safe for their workers. IBM and the chemical manufacturers involved in our lawsuit sold toxic solvents and never warned the workers or health authorities the truth about these health hazards. Few are aware of the massive amounts of chemicals that are used in these industrial processes, or the fact that IBM is among the largest user of industrial chemicals in the United States. With tragic results, IBM never shared the scientific and medical information that IBM toxicologists secretly provided to IBM executives. In fact, virtually none of the employees of IBM ever knew that IBM had 2 teams of toxicologists conducting secret studies and investigations of IBM workers. IBM's chief toxicologist now claim that in the early 1980s, IBM regularly monitored animal toxicology studies and microbial genotoxicity tests to determine adverse health effects, and that IBM attempted to predict, based on extrapolation from those studies, the possible human health effects. IBM also claimed to correlate this information with medical surveillance examinations and clinical biochemistry through blood and urine testing observations of its own employees. But that is highly improbable because IBM toxicologists never told IBM workers that the world medical and scientific literature at the time showed that solvents used in the manufacture of semiconductors caused the following: deformed testicles, reduction in sperm counts, disruption in menstrual cycles, suppression of ovulation, increased spontaneous abortions, reduction in pregnancies and birth defects, and severe malformations. The medical and scientific literature available to everyone in the world at the time, some of which we have, makes absolutely clear that organic solvents and their metabolic breakdown products damage the male and female reproductive systems and have profound developmental toxicity. This warning flag has been waving since the 1970s with increasing fervor. Children of IBM cleanroom employees have been born with severe birth defects, including microcephaly, ocular malformations and blindness, facial malformations, cardiac malformations, and skeletal malformations. Our lawsuits against IBM allege that there is no family history of birth defects in these children, and either one parent or both at the time of conception or their mother during pregnancy worked with IBM cleanroom chemicals. These workers were entitled to be protected from these chemicals and to be given the available scientific information. That did not happen. IBM workers, their children, and their surviving families are paying the price in very human terms. In fact, it is worse than imagined because chemicals that are mutagens are also carcinogens. One IBM employee worked in materials analysis in the materials analysis department from 1966 to 1979. Of the 14 employees in his department, 6 have died of brain tumors, intestinal cancer, and leukemia. 2 have bone tumors. 8 workers out of 14 is outrageous proof that at IBM extremely dangerous chemicals were used with completely inadequate precautions. Other IBM employees have cancers of the testicles, ovaries, uterus, breast, skin, kidney, bladder, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and multiple myeloma, that the doctor alluded to. During the course of my investigation of IBM, we have discovered the details of a confidential file of death records maintained by IBM. IBM toxicologists in the United States have collected more than 10,000 death certificates. We have begun a detailed study of the IBM death certificates, which are revealing that the rate of cancer for IBM employees is twice as great as the rate for the general population. More striking is that the number of brain cancers for IBM workers is 6 times higher than the rate of brain cancer in the general population. That is just the tip of the iceberg. I just want to give you a quick update, if I can, in terms of the litigation. The first case that we brought to trial was a case involving a 15-year-old boy whose mother and father worked at the facility in East Fishkill. His name is Zachary Ruffing. We reached a settlement on Zachary's behalf at the 11th and a half hour before jury selection. I can't share the details of that settlement because it is a confidential settlement. I can tell you in the interim we have reached global settlements on behalf of all of our clients with 6 of the chemical companies. Presently on trial right now are 2 of my colleagues who have been mentioned. That's Dick Alexander and Amanda Hawes. Those cases are pending out in the Superior Court in San Jose. Without boring you with the legal difference, I just want to inform you of the following. The standard of proof on the cases or in the cases that are presently on trial in San Jose and Superior Court is very, very different than the standard of proof here in the state of New York. In those cases, we are required to prove that IBM knowingly exposed its manufacturing workers to chemicals that cause systemic poisons. We don't have that burden here in the state of New York. What I can tell you is the following. In the state of New York, on behalf of anybody who has either contracted cancer or who has died of cancer, we have sued the chemical companies directly. We did not sue IBM directly because under the workers' compensation laws in this state and in most other states, you cannot sue your employer in a negligence theory. However, what has happened is the chemical company said, listen, you know what, our chemicals are fine, they don't cause cancer, but if they do cause cancer, it's IBM's fault because they control the workplace. So they turned around, chemical companies did, and they sued IBM. The difference on the cases involving the children who suffer from severe and crippling birth defects is because they are not employees of the company. Those cases we have sued on their behalf IBM directly. So IBM is a direct defendant in the birth defect cases. I just got word today as I was leaving from the judge in Westchester that the first case scheduled to go to trial will go to trial on March 2nd. We will begin jury selection. I won't know which case that is exactly. Likely it will be a birth defect case. One of the things that happened on the case that we have, the case that I suspect will go to trial, it was a young Afro-American woman, just so you can understand the outrageous conduct of IBM, who showed up to work on the first day. She informed the doctor at IBM that she was in fact pregnant. She was sent down to the nurse and to the doctor. She was examined. The IBM records show, in fact, that she was pregnant, so they were aware of it. They then sent her back to a place where they knew women of childbearing years or pregnant women should not be, because they didn't really have anything else to do with her for a while. So they left her there for about 6 weeks, and then they sent her to a really wonderful place that they colloquially call the dungeon. That room has literally been hermetically sealed over at the East Fishkill facility. That's how bad it is. Her child was born without any kneecaps. She was born retarded. She has a trach tube. And we advanced a theory, a fraud theory, which allows us to collect punitive damages against IBM that was initially rejected by the trial court. We appealed that, and we argued in front of the appellate division in the second department, and the trial court's ruling was reversed, and we will be arguing shortly before the Court of Appeals, which is the highest court in the state of New York, and we are very, very confident that we will be proceeding against IBM on a punitive damage claim in that particular case. So that's pretty much all I have to say, and that's where we are in terms of litigation, and I'd be more than happy to take any questions or turn it back to the Congressman. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deprospo. Ladies and gentlemen, we have some time for questions. If you would care to ask a question, I would ask if you would come to the microphone and direct your question to one of our panelists.
Welcome to our city here, Congressman, and the folks that are on the panel here today. I have two questions, or part A and B, of questions for the good doctors. We've been told in the diagnosis of the testing here that, let's assume, 8 parts per billion of whatever chemical it is going to be below the level that will harm you. However, if you are living in a residence for 24 hours a day, what are the ramifications over, say, a 20 or 25-year period? In other words, a little poison won't hurt you, but in 25 years, what does it do? Now, I'm a member of RAGE, Risk and Action Group of Endicott, and we seek to get these answers, and some of them we just are not able to obtain, and we can't find someone that would answer those. I know that you don't have an answer to this right away, but it's something to consider. What are the ramifications over a long period of time? The other item I want to mention goes along with the IBM workers. Let's take those 8 parts per billion in a workplace, and OSHA says that's fine. Now, what I have a problem here is that 8 parts per billion for an 8-hour work period, or is it really over 24 hours? In other words, you're exposed for 8 hours, but in 24 hours your body will zero that out. So if you're okay for 8 parts per billion in 8 hours and you work a shift and a half, does that mean that 12 parts are okay for you?
Thank you for two really great questions. I'd have to agree with you. I'll answer your second question first because I think it gets a shorter answer. To answer your second question, I think unfortunately the answer is I just don't know. OSHA has designed a lot of their scientific studies to focus on 8-hour work days, but you're very apt to point out that a lot of IBM workers and other workers in other workplaces work 12, 16-hour days, and in all honesty, we don't know what the amount of exposure, what the level it is at that over that longer time that is actually safe. It's probably at least equal to, if not lower, than that level that OSHA has provided. Do I know what that exactly is? Unfortunately, I don't. To answer your first question, I think it's a very similar question, but it's a really good one. I think that's why I made a very strong case for not only a really systematic study of workers here in Endicott and families here in Endicott in the community, but why I raised that point about the statewide network of children's environmental health centers that I had mentioned in my discussion and proposal. Because I often, as a pediatrician and an environmental health specialist, I find that my hands are tied behind my back because of the lack of good data and good understanding of the health effects of many of these chemicals. I often have to go to, at best, animal studies or studies where people that are difficult to really analyze because we don't know, for example, what the health effects of multiple chemicals at the same time are. And that gets very confusing. And many people, like those at IBM and like the example that you raised, were exposed to multiple chemicals at once. And I have no idea. If I have enough trouble figuring out what one chemical's health effect is at a small dose over a longer period of time, I can tell you that much less about 4 chemicals, for example, at the same time, even in those little doses. And that's crippling for me, frankly, as a pediatrician to be able to tell you and give you the best health advice that I can, just like my adult medicine and occupational medicine colleagues have that same problem, to be quite honest with you. There's one thing I'll add. We are trying to do our best, and I hope with the Congressman's help, there's a national longitudinal study of children's health that is being developed and hopefully will get fully funded at the National Institute for Child Health Development, that will look at environmental health exposures from birth all the way till 21, and it will start to be able to get at some of the questions that you raise. The problem with many of the studies that we do on workers, for example, is we look at them after the fact, and we look at a lot of environmental health exposures after the fact. The problem is, as researchers, we would love to know from ground zero all the way through to age 21, 65, what have you, what the health effects are in a prospective, in a looking forward kind of way. And that gives us the best information so that we can help educate you. And I think that's the ultimate study that will help start to clarify many of the questions that you raised.
Well, as I understand it, NIOSH is the investigative arm of OSHA.
Exactly.
And those are the people that have to get involved here if we're going to get any answers to these things. And like I said, I knew you couldn't answer that.
Sure.
And I'm not going to take too much time, but I would like to make a comment to the counselor over here. And this is what we've been informed about, that in many cases, the people online at IBM that have worked there, whether a short period or a long period of time, work with chemicals that were brought out and put online in their tanks. And that was brought out in a 1-gallon pail or a 5-gallon pail. When the material was delivered to IBM, it came in a 55-gallon drum that was properly labeled, the caution, the skull and crossbones, or whatever they had on it. But in fact, what they did online was take out the 5 gallons from the 55 gallons and bring them out in a plastic bucket. And the workers had no indication what was in there. That's something for you to think about. We've heard that several times. Thank you.
Before we take this question, I just want to comment a little bit. I'd just like to follow up on something, just a couple of things. First of all, I appreciate your comment about that, and you're in fact right, and I did uncover that very, very early on. When we went and we did an inspection of the IBM clean rooms, what happens is, if you ever driven down the New Jersey Turnpike, you see those big chemical plants, on either side of it. Inside these manufacturing facilities, they literally pipe in hundreds of thousands of gallons of toxic chemicals day in and day out. And you're absolutely right, because the workers that we represent, who are actually in areas that they call chem mix, were unloading the 55-gallon drums with all the warnings on it. You're exactly right. What they did was they took them out and they put them in other bottles without warnings. Another thing that they did was they actually have a system, so they claim, that you can go onto, like a computer system, to see what the chemicals do and everything like that. The problem was, when you worked in a clean room, you had to go in, you had to take this air shower, and you had to put the bunny suit on, and you were working for 8, 10, sometimes 12 hours at a shift when they had the flying squads going on. And the computer, there was like one terminal, was like 300,000 miles away, and you needed a PhD in computer sciences to figure out how to use it. So it was really impractical. So that's a good point. What the doctor was talking about is something that we call synergy of chemicals, and if I can, I just want to follow up on that. What he said was, so sometimes I like to bridge the gap between the doctors and the lay people. That's part of my job as a trial lawyer, is the following. Sometimes the government and doctors take a look at something and they analyze Bosco, for example, in a laboratory, and they say, okay, you can drink two glasses of this a week and you'll be okay. And then they go to the Coca-Cola study and they say, all right, you know what, you can have 3 glasses of this a week and you'll be okay. What they don't study is what happens if you take the Bosco and you mix it in with the Coca-Cola. And that's what the doctor is talking about. And that's something that they don't study. So that's what we need to study, because we know that there are tens of thousands of chemicals that go in and out of there that we know cause cancer. We know that they cause birth defects. What we don't know is what happens when they mix them together, and that's something that we need to take a look at. So what the typical company line for IBM is, they say, listen, you know what, they did a study of this, and it's okay, 3 parts per million or 8 parts per billion or whatever it is, so that's okay. But they have 16 chemicals at the same workstation, they recirculate the air, and they don't take that into account, or they don't want us to take that into account. I also want to tell you about the corporate misconduct of IBM. Well, you know what? They actually did monitoring and they did studying, and this is how they would do it. Those, particularly back in the 80s and the 90s, IBM was having a great deal of financial difficulty, and they were literally working these fabs 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And I actually obtained the documents wherein IBM management rehearsed the IBM workforce to mislead the OSHA investigators. I actually have the script in my office, and it has been produced, wherein they were taught how to lie to OSHA investigators. And I know that that's something that I've shared with the Congressman, and I know he was very, very concerned about that. The other thing, you made a mention about NIOSH. I want to tell you about the investigative arm of NIOSH. With regard to one group of chemicals, and I know Dr. Trasande is aware of this, they're called ethylene-based glycoethers. The number 2 guy at NIOSH, a gentleman by the name of Brian Harden, actually in the 1980s went around to all of these chemical companies, IBM included, and warned them of the dangers of this family of chemicals. We know that because he has notes and everything like that, and they've been produced. These ethylene-based glycoethers, as the doctor knows and I shared with the Congressman, were also used in paints in the automotive industry, because the automotive industry has a very, very powerful union called the United Auto Workers. Inside of, depending upon which study you look at, either a year or 18 months, those chemicals were taken out of the paints. It took IBM, even if you believe them, anywhere from 13 to 16 years to take them out of the workplace. And I know I've shared this with the Congressman, to the Congressman, to myself, and to the doctor, and to the people that have suffered. That is just unacceptable. They claim that they've taken them out. We don't know if that is in fact true, but I know the Congressman is going to be looking into that. So I just wanted to bring that to your attention. That's a couple of follow-ups to the points that you brought out, and they were well made. Thank you.
My name is Tom Tizavanis. I'm a lifelong village resident. In December of 1952, I was honorably discharged from the United States Army after serving in the Korean conflict. 2 weeks after I was discharged, I was fortunate to get hired by IBM. Back then, that was the place to work. And in December of 1989, I retired. In those years, the majority of my time working was, part of it was on the assembly line, but the majority of my time was spent in what we call solution maintenance, and that entailed taking care of the baths that would put the copper on the panels. So my job was to maintain these baths, and we worked with the chemicals that were spoken about here by you people. And the thing that I would like to find out from someone up at that panel there is I've been trying to get my medical records, and I wrote to IBM, and the answer that I received from them was, there's so many years that have gone by, they can't locate my records. And from what I understand, they should have these records as long as I'm still alive. But I don't know where to go from here. I'd like to have these records so I could probably show them to my doctor, because I've been having problems that I attributed back then to all the overtime that we've been working. We were working a tremendous amount of overtime, and I figured, well, everybody's tired. And I just let it go at that. So what I'm trying to do is get my records, and if anybody there at the panel can tell me where I can go from here, I'm at a dead end. Thank you.
Sounds like a legal question.
Are they telling you that they don't exist, or that they're refusing to turn them over?
They can't find them.
Okay, well, I'll tell you what, I'll give you my card, you give me a call, I'll help you get those records. Okay?
You give me a card?
Yeah, my business card, and you can call me. We'll help you get the records.
Before I leave here tonight?
Yeah, as soon as we're done, I'll give you one of my cards.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
I mean, that's some of what we need to start doing, is getting medical records from employees that have worked there for so many years. You know, the gentleman mentioned working overtime. And then earlier the question was about, you know, an 8-hour shift and the parts per billion. Well, we had people working 10, 12 hours a day, working with 5 or 6 different chemicals. You know, in Building 18, where I think some people work here, the clocks were pitted on the face of the clocks.